Today, we delve into a historical account from the early years of the American Republic, focusing on an event in Butler County, Pennsylvania, in 1792. This story involves Massey Harbison, a frontier woman whose life was profoundly marked by the violent conflicts of the time. Her husband, John Harbison, survived the catastrophic defeat of General Arthur St. Clair's forces in November 1791, an engagement widely regarded as the worst loss suffered by the United States Army in its early history. Just 6 months later, in May 1792, Massey Harbison's home was attacked by a group of Native Americans, leading to her harrowing capture and ordeal. The details of Massey Harbison's experience are preserved in her book, a narrative of the sufferings of Massey Harbison from Indian barbarity, first published in 1825. This work not only recounts her captivity, but also the tragic loss of her children and her eventual escape. While Massey had shared a shorter version of her experience shortly after her return home in 1792, she wrote the expanded narrative decades later, following the death of her husband in 1822. The book served both as a detailed historical record and as a means of financial support for a widowed woman facing economic hardship. In Chapter 4 of her book, titled Captivity, Murder of My Children, and Escape, Massey Harbison reflects on the trials of life and the extraordinary challenges she endured. The chapter begins with her husband's recovery from the wound he sustained in St. Clair's defeat. By March 22, 1792, John Harbison was appointed as a scout to monitor Native American movements in the area, a position critical for the security of frontier settlements. This sense of increased vigilance brought a temporary semblance of calm to the region's inhabitants, though it proved to be a fragile peace, as subsequent events would tragically demonstrate. By 1792, those who had spent nearly a year sheltered in the blockhouse began returning to their homes and resumed cultivating their farms. The spies who patrolled the area observed nothing alarming to suggest imminent danger until the tragic morning of my captivity. They often came to our house for food and rest. On the evening of May 15th, my husband, along with Captain Guthrie and other scouts, arrived home late and asked for supper. I asked one of the scouts, William Maxwell, to accompany me to the spring and spring house to fetch water. While there, we both distinctly heard a sound resembling the bleating of a lamb or fawn, which greatly alarmed us and hastened our return to the house. Whether this sound was an Indian decoy or an omen of the horror to come, I cannot say, but from that moment a sense of foreboding gripped me. I begged my husband to move us to a safer place to avoid the threat of an attack. However, fate had other plans for me. Providence decreed that I would endure the savage's rage, only to be saved through divine mercy. On the night of May 21st, two spies, James Davis and Mr. Sutton, stayed at our home. At dawn on May 22nd, the horn sounded at the blockhouse, which was visible from our house and stood about 200 yards away. The spies rose and left. Though awake, I remained in bed, nursing my infant. Sleep overtook me briefly, but I awoke to the terrifying sight of Indians pulling me from the bed by my feet. The room was full of them, each carrying a gun in one hand and a tomahawk in the other. Realizing the peril, I sprang to the floor, clutching my infant. In the struggle to put on additional clothing, the Indians stripped me of what little I managed to gather, leaving me as I had been in bed. While I grappled with the savages, others seized my two older children from another bed, then ransacked the house, destroying what they could not take. The chaos was punctuated by violence. Mr. Wolfe, a neighbor who fled toward the blockhouse, was shot at by 7 or 8 Indians. Although he was hit in the arm, breaking it, he managed to reach safety. The commissary and his assistant, staying in a nearby storehouse, also encountered danger. The commissary narrowly escaped to the blockhouse, his handkerchief pierced by a bullet that took part of his hair. His assistant, however, was not so fortunate, struck by 2 bullets and killed near the door. Inside my home, the horror deepened. My middle child, just 3 years old, cried bitterly and clung to the fire's warmth. When the Indians attempted to take him, his resistance enraged them. They seized him by the feet and brutally dashed his head against the door's threshold, killing him instantly. They then scalped and stabbed his lifeless body. Overwhelmed with grief, I screamed, uncontrollably, nearly losing consciousness until a blow to my face revived me. The Indians then forced me and my eldest son, a boy of 5, to leave with them. My attempts to divert their attention to the blockhouse, hoping to escape to a nearby subterranean rock, only hastened their retreat from the settlement. They flogged me to keep pace, dragging me into captivity. Unbeknownst to me, the blockhouse's defenders were on the verge of running out of ammunition, and the Indians' retreat spared them from certain defeat. Through this harrowing ordeal, I carried my infant in my arms, the memory of my slain child etched forever in my mind. After my children's murder, the Indians forced me to march along the top of the bank for about 40 to 60 rods before stopping to divide the plunder taken from my house. It was here that I counted their number, 32, including 2 white men painted as Indians. Several of the Indians spoke English fluently, and I recognized some of them, as they had previously traveled up and down the Allegheny River. 2 belonged to the Seneca tribe, and 2 others were Munsees, whom I had seen before at my Uncle John Curry's shop to have their guns repaired. We continued for another 40 rods before they captured my uncle's horses. 2 Indians took charge of me and placed me on one of the horses, leading us toward the mouth of the Kiskiminetas River. The rest of the group went off in the direction of Puckety. When we reached a steep bank descending to the Allegheny River, the incline appeared so dangerous that I threw myself off the horse, despite the Indians' commands to stay on. My horse made it down without incident, but the horse carrying my little boy and an Indian fell repeatedly during the descent. My son fell off, but thankfully he was not seriously injured and was picked up by another Indian. When we reached the riverbank, they retrieved bark canoes hidden under the rocks near the island between the Kiskiminetas and Buffalo. Unable to force the horses into the river, the Indians abandoned them and loaded us into the canoes instead. We landed on the island, and there I faced yet another heartbreaking scene. My little boy, still mourning his younger brother and complaining of injuries from the fall, became the next victim. One Indian ordered me away, likely so I would not witness what was about to happen. Another then used his tomahawk to kill and scalp him. The horror overwhelmed me, and I collapsed to the ground with my infant still in my arms. My senses left me for an unknown period. When I regained consciousness, I saw the scalp of my son, fresh and bleeding, in the hands of a savage. My anguish was indescribable, and I sank to the ground again in despair. The Indians, showing no mercy, revived me with blows. Once I could stand, they led me to the river, forcing me into the cold water up to my knees, which finally restored my full awareness. Their cruelty continued unabated. We resumed the journey by crossing several waterways, including the Connoquenessing Creek, where Butler now stands, and traveled another 5 or 6 miles to Little Buffalo. At one point, I became so weary and despondent that I determined to provoke the savages into killing me, believing death preferable to the endless suffering. I threw off the horn they had placed on my shoulder multiple times, expecting each act of defiance to be my last. Instead, one savage who claimed me as his squaw intervened and prevented the others from harming me, cursing them for their laziness. We reached an Indian camp at Salt Lick, about 2 miles above present-day Butler, just before nightfall. The camp was large, with a structure of chestnut bark capable of sheltering 50 men. Paths radiated out from it in various directions, showing it had been occupied for some time. That night, they took me a few hundred yards from the camp into a dense, dark thicket. There, they laid a blanket on the ground and bound my arms tightly behind me, leaving just enough movement to care for my infant. 2 savages who had killed my children stayed on either side of me. Without fire, food, or any comfort, I endured the first night of my captivity in this desolate place. With my baby in my constrained arms, and my heart shattered by the loss of my 2 other children, I sat awake, haunted by the day's horrors. Mothers who have not faced such barbarity or endured such misery can scarcely imagine the agony I experienced. While you enjoy the warmth and safety of your homes, I passed that night in unimaginable torment, stripped of everything, except the will to survive. Sympathize with me as a pioneer enduring trials that few can fathom. The exhaustion of the previous day had drained me so completely that, despite my resolve to escape, I fell into a restless sleep. During the night, I dreamt repeatedly of my escape and safe arrival in Pittsburgh, imagining details of the town I had never seen but later found to be true. The first night passed with no opportunity for escape, as the Indians kept a vigilant watch, remaining awake the entire time. At dawn, one of the savages left to watch the trail for any pursuing white settlers. Left with the remaining Indian, who had murdered my last boy, I endured yet another horrific scene. He took out my child's scalp and began stretching it over a hoop. Words cannot describe the torment I felt. Few mothers have endured such unimaginable grief. Overwhelmed by rage and grief, I attempted to seize his tomahawk, which rested nearby, planning to strike him down. Just as I thought I would succeed, he detected me, cursed me, and accused me of being a Yankee, fully understanding my intent. To excuse my actions, I claimed my child. I wanted to play with the tomahawk's handle. His terrifying gaze hinted at his cruel heart. Yet once again, God preserved me. Later that day, he inspected the plunder from my house and found my pocketbook containing 10 silver dollars and half a guinea in gold. For sustenance, they gave me and my child a meager portion of dry venison, but I could not eat due to the injuries to my jaw from their earlier blows. I broke the food into pieces and gave it to my child instead. That evening, the other Indian returned, and they moved me to another site, securing me between them as they had the previous night. Again, I drifted into sleep, haunted by dreams of Pittsburgh. On the morning of May 24th, a flock of mockingbirds and robins appeared, their songs stirring within me the hope of escape. One Indian went to watch the trail as before, leaving the other to guard me. Observing that he appeared to be dozing, I feigned sleep, snoring lightly to lull him into a deeper rest. When he finally fell asleep, I prepared to flee, unable to harm him without putting my child down, whose cries would surely raise the alarm. I quietly gathered a few items from the plundered goods, a short gown, a handkerchief, and a child's frock. With these, I slipped away as the sun rose. At first, I followed the bird's guidance to mislead the Indians, then altered my direction, crossing the Connoquenessing Creek at a point we had passed earlier. I continued downstream, navigating rocks, thorns, and briars on bare feet until I realized, by the sun's position, that I was heading away from home. Correcting my course, I climbed a hill and rested until nightfall. As the evening star rose, I used it to guide my next steps. Despite my aching feet, now full of thorns, and my hunger, I managed to sleep again, holding my child close. On May 25th, I resumed my journey. By evening, rain began to fall, forcing me to gather leaves to create a makeshift bed. My child's cries, however, drew my attention to the sound of footsteps nearby. Fearing recapture, I searched for a hiding place and discovered the branches of a fallen tree. Crawling underneath with my child, I remained motionless, hoping the darkness would shield us. The footsteps belonged to an Indian who had been tracking me. He halted near my hiding place, placing his gun down. My child, warmed by my embrace, fell silent, a providential blessing in that critical moment. The savage stood mere feet away, listening intently for 2 hours. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it might betray me. At last, a distant cry, resembling that of a night owl, called him away. After answering with a blood-curdling yell, he departed. Terrified that the Indians might return with daylight, I decided not to remain in my hiding spot. I pressed onward, determined to evade capture. The wilderness and its perils seemed less threatening than the tomahawk or scalping knife, and I resolved to reach safety, no matter the cost. By the 5th night of my captivity, exhaustion had overtaken me. Nature itself seemed nearly spent, and I struggled to move from my resting place. Yet, driven by necessity and the instinct for self-preservation, I wrapped my coat around my child, gripping its end with my teeth. With one arm supporting my baby and the other groping through the darkness, I trudged forward, perhaps a mile or two, before collapsing at the base of a tree until morning. The night was cold and wet, adding to the hardships of 4 days filled with hunger, danger, and unrelenting trials. On the morning of Saturday, May 26th, wet, weary, and starving, I resumed my journey at first light. That day, I stumbled upon the headwaters of Pine Creek, though I did not recognize it at the time. Crossing the stream, I discovered 2 fresh moccasin tracks in a path leading the same way I was heading. Alarmed but resolved, I continued cautiously, knowing I could likely spot the men before they saw me. After about 3 miles, I came to a fork in the path, where another branch joined the creek. There, I found signs of a hunter's camp, a smoldering fire, and evidence that the men had recently breakfasted before moving on. Uneasy, I decided to leave the path and ascend a nearby ridge towards Squaw Run. There, as I paused to consider my next move, I spotted 3 deer racing past me. They turned briefly to glance behind them, and I did the same, catching sight of the flash of a gun followed by its report. Soon after, dogs appeared in pursuit of the deer. Fearing hunters, I sought shelter behind a large log but providentially did not reach it. As I crouched to peer over, I noticed a heap of rattlesnakes, with one large serpent coiled near my face, poised to strike. Horrified, I withdrew immediately, abandoning that hiding spot. Forced to change my route once more, I descended toward the headwaters of Squaw Run, following its course for the rest of the day. The rain continued, soaking me to the bone and amplifying my misery. My body shivered uncontrollably, and despite my efforts to suppress it, I frequently let out involuntary groans. Hunger gnawed at me, and although the injuries to my jaw from the Indians' blows were slowly healing, I could only chew on grapevines to stave off starvation. That evening, I unknowingly came within a mile of the Allegheny River. Too exhausted to continue, I sought refuge at the base of another tree, enduring a torrential downpour. To shield my infant from the storm, I held him in my lap and leaned my head against the trunk, letting the rain drench me. There I spent my 5th night in captivity, battered by the elements and despair. On Sunday, the 6th morning of my ordeal, I awoke so debilitated that I could scarcely lift myself from the ground. Only through immense struggle did I manage to stand, but my body was weak and my spirit utterly crushed. My progress was painfully slow, each step a battle against my failing strength and overwhelming discouragement. The trials of hunger, fatigue, and relentless rain pressed heavily upon me, yet I forced myself onward, driven by the faint hope of survival. In her nearly helpless state, Massey Harbison continued forward and eventually came across a path marked by cattle tracks. Believing it might lead to a settlement, she followed the path for about a mile, where she discovered an abandoned cabin. Though she was in a river bottom, she had no idea where she was or even which river she had reached. Overcome with despair, she entered the cabin and considered giving in to her misery, lying down to die. Death, she thought, would be a mercy, freeing her from her suffering. However, the thought of her infant enduring hunger and abandonment after her death stopped her. In this moment of hopelessness, Massey heard the sound of a cowbell. The sound reignited a glimmer of hope, and she followed it, eventually reaching the riverbank. Opposite 6 Mile Island, there, she saw 3 men on the other side of the Allegheny River. The sight of them filled her with indescribable relief, though she struggled to call out to them. The men, wary of an ambush, hesitated and asked her to identify herself. She shouted that she was the woman taken prisoner by Indians and had escaped. They asked her to walk along the riverbank so they could be sure it was not a decoy, but she replied that her feet were too sore to move further. One of the men, James Closer, got into a canoe to bring her across while the others kept their rifles ready in case of an ambush. As he approached and saw her haggard state, he exclaimed, "Who in the name of God are you?" Closer, once her neighbor, could not recognize her after the ordeal she had endured in only 6 days. When she reached the safety of the inhabited side of the river, people from the fort rushed to her aid, taking her infant from her arms and carrying her to the home of Mr. Cordes. Finally safe, Massey's long-suppressed emotions overwhelmed her. She recalled the horrors of her captivity, the murders of her children, the scalping of her son, and her desperate flight through the wilderness. Throughout her ordeal, she had not cried. Tears were a luxury she could not afford in the face of the savage's cruelty. Now, freed from immediate danger, the tears came freely, bringing her a bittersweet sense of relief. Inside the house, her exposure to the fire's warmth and the smell of food caused her to faint, her body too fragile to bear even comfort. The people tried to revive her and clothe her, but their well-intentioned kindness might have worsened her condition had it not been for the timely arrival of Major Macaulay, who commanded the river line. He ordered her removed from the heat and restricted her intake to small amounts of whey, which he administered himself. Through his care, she slowly began to recover. Two women, Sarah Carter and Mary and Crozier, tenderly removed thorns from Massey's feet and legs. 150 were counted that evening, with many more extracted later in Pittsburgh. Her skin was raw from exposure, and the flesh on her feet was mangled and torn. For 2 weeks, she could not stand or walk, her body bearing the scars of her ordeal. Word of Massey's survival spread quickly. Spies James Amberson and John Thompson, whose track she had followed earlier, soon arrived at the fort. That evening, they took news of her escape to Coe Station and then to Reed Station, where her husband learned she was alive. By the next morning, news had reached Pittsburgh, prompting officials to send for her to give a deposition. Unable to walk or ride, Massey was carried by canoe to Pittsburgh, where she recounted her experiences to John Wilkins. Her testimony was later published in newspapers across the nation and preserved in Loudon's narratives of Indian outrages, ensuring her story would be remembered. Massey's ordeal did not end with her escape. The remains of her murdered child were recovered and buried 9 days after the attack, guided by her directions. Yet, despite her suffering, Massey and her infant son, John Harbison, survived. John would live to the age of 87, passing away in 1878 in Lynn County, Iowa. Massey, who was pregnant during her captivity, gave birth to another son, James Harbison, later that year. She went on to have 5 more children, the youngest born in 1815 when she was 45 years old. Massey's account serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the horrors endured by settlers during the Northwestern Indian War. Her escape, aided by her unyielding determination and what some might consider divine intervention, remains a powerful story of survival against all odds.